Welcome. Today, we are undertaking a very intensive examination of the sources surrounding an event that truly shocked the UK. It's an event that highlighted these devastating intersections of mental health, digital influence, and prejudice. The murder of 16-year-old Brianna Ghey. This case, defined by the youth of those involved, the extreme violence, and the significant societal aftermath, it demands an approach of the utmost seriousness and respect for the victim and her family.
It absolutely does. And our goal today is to cut through some of the noise and provide you with a clear, structured understanding of the facts that were presented during the legal proceedings. We'll be focusing on the evidence of premeditation, the really complex psychiatric considerations that were debated in court, the verdict and sentencing, and then finally, the major social and political movements that emerged in Brianna's memory.
So Brianna Ghey, a year 11 pupil from Warrington, was a young transgender girl who was fatally attacked on February 11th, 2023 in Culcheth Linear Park. The truly shocking element here is the age of the perpetrators, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, who were both 15 when they committed this calculated crime and were subsequently convicted of her murder. The details of their planning are what really elevate this tragedy far beyond, a simple crime of opportunity.
Exactly. The documents we've reviewed outline a chilling sequence of events, starting long before that day in the park. This wasn't just a physical crime, it was a psychological one, rooted in a dark online fantasy that tragically crossed into reality. Understanding the background of all the individuals involved is really the only way to make sense of the subsequent court arguments regarding motive, responsibility, and manipulation.
Let's begin with Brianna Ghey herself. At 16, she was navigating the normal pressures of school and social life. But the sources make it clear she faced additional layers of difficulty, particularly concerning her health and her identity.
That's absolutely critical context. The records show Brianna was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism, and anxiety. And these weren't just background details, they actively influenced her ability to navigate the world. Her mother emphasized to the court that these diagnoses severely impaired Brianna's capacity to identify dangerous situations and gauge risks accurately. This vulnerability really made her susceptible to manipulation.
And that makes the environment where she met one of her eventual killers all the more disturbing. Because of those diagnoses, Brianna was often outside the main classroom setting, requiring one-on-one tutoring in her school's inclusion room. And that inclusion room is precisely where she met Scarlett Jenkinson.
It's a profound and tragic irony, isn't it? A place that's intended for focused support and safety became the setting for this deadly relationship to begin. And Brianna, despite her own struggles, was known for her compassion within the community. The sources note she was very active in helping younger transgender girls safely and legally access hormone therapy resources. It really showcases her willingness to support others navigating similar paths.
Yet, the sources paint a starkly conflicting picture of her social experience overall. On one hand, she was a supporter. On the other, she reportedly endured just intense harassment.
This contradiction is a really critical point that the sources present. Her friends and other community sources allege that Brianna had faced years of transphobic harassment and bullying. This included shocking claims that she had been subjected to repeated gang beatings prior to her death. But simultaneously, the head teacher of Birchwood Community High School released a statement, and this was approved by Brianna's mother, which explicitly denied that Brianna had faced any bullying while enrolled at that specific school.
So that makes establishing the full scope of the harassment she faced incredibly difficult. It speaks perhaps to the difference between internal school dynamics and the external hostility she experienced online and in the community.
I think that's right. And beyond her school life, she was very visible online. Brianna was known as a TikToker, primarily sharing videos where she mimed and danced to popular songs. While the exact numbers varied across reports, anywhere from 11,000 to 63,000 followers, the key takeaway is that she had a public, approachable digital presence.
And we have one final poignant piece of digital communication from her life, the TikTok post where she mentioned being excluded from school. That detail just adds to the context of her anxiety and her isolation in the time leading up to the attack.
Right. It all builds a picture of her vulnerability.
Let's turn now to the two individuals who planned and executed the murder, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe. They both shared a connection through Culcheth High School, though Jenkinson's path diverged pretty dramatically before the crime.
Jenkinson's history is defined by a deeply concerning incident that occurred just months before she met Brianna. In September 2022, she was permanently excluded from Culcheth High School. The reason was extremely serious. She brought cannabidiol-infused edibles, so drug-laced treats, to school and gave them to a younger classmate who became very ill. The police recorded this incident as spiking.
That initial act of deliberate harm, classified as spiking, preceded her first attempt to kill Brianna by only 4 months. It suggests a rapid escalation of antisocial and dangerous behavior.
Precisely. Following that exclusion, she was allowed to transfer to Birchwood Community High School, and that's where she met Brianna in the inclusion room. What began as an apparent friendship quickly devolved into a predatory obsession. Text messages analyzed during the trial revealed Jenkinson's fixation on Ghey.
And the sources provide a direct quote from Jenkinson to a child psychiatrist that it speaks volumes about her disturbed internal state and motive.
Yes, she stated that she felt she was about to lose Ghey as a friend, and she wanted to kill her so she would always be with her. That's the language of possessive pathology. It suggests a need to immortalize or control Brianna through violence, entirely separate from any hostility related to gender identity.
Her private world was just saturated with violence. The sources confirm her intense, dedicated fascination with notorious serial killers, people like Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy. But it goes far beyond just watching true crime documentaries, doesn't it?
Far beyond. The evidence showed she kept detailed notes on these figures, which suggests study rather than mere entertainment. And crucially, she was technologically savvy enough to use the Tor browser to access the dark web, specifically to watch videos depicting torture and murder. This immersion in extreme sadism provided the blueprint and the mental framework for the eventual crime. It really speaks to a form of digital radicalization driven by her own dark fantasies.
Then we have Eddie Ratcliffe, who seems to present a profile of high achievement mixed with this profound isolation.
That's right. Ratcliffe was described as highly intelligent and academically successful, achieving top grades. He was even recognized by a fellow student as something of a role model. He had a background in organized sports, too, having competed internationally as an amateur kickboxer in 2018.
Yet, despite this high-functioning exterior, Jenkinson's own description of him in her notebook suggested deep social difficulties.
Jenkinson described him as intelligent but also socially awkward and very much a loner. Neighbors corroborated this, recording no prior signs of violence or aggression from him. However, his private interest was disturbing, a fascination with knives. He collected blades, and significantly, he purchased the 5-inch hunting knife that would become the murder weapon, and he bought it during a family skiing trip to Bulgaria. This detail established his vital role in providing the instrument of death long before the fatal encounter.
The combination of his social isolation and his fascination with weapons made him, I guess, highly susceptible to Jenkinson's obsessive planning and manipulation.
It seems that way, yes.
So the core of the prosecution's case rested on the extraordinary extent of the premeditation. This wasn't a sudden escalation of violence. It was a sustained, calculated campaign against Brianna Ghey that lasted weeks, if not months.
The initial attempt to murder Brianna through poisoning is the clearest indicator of this calculation. The sources lay out the shocking details of Jenkinson's first attempt to end Brianna's life using an excessive dose of ibuprofen.
Can you elaborate on the specifics of that failed attempt? Why does it speak so powerfully to the malicious intent?
Well, Brianna ingested the drug and became violently ill, so sick, in fact, that her mother initially feared she was suffering from appendicitis and sought emergency care. The intent behind this method was critical. Jenkinson was attempting to create a death that would be mistaken for a suicidal overdose. Given Brianna's known struggles with anxiety and her prior diagnoses, Jenkinson calculated that emergency services and the family would assume the death was self-inflicted. It would have provided perfect cover for the murder.
And after that failed attempt, the planning escalated to the stabbing plot involving Ratcliffe and his hunting knife. The text messages exchanged between the killers, which the police recovered, are perhaps the most damning evidence of their shared sadistic motivation.
They absolutely are. Jenkinson was explicit about her fixation on Brianna, describing her as really pretty and really different. But the context of their planning discussions went beyond Brianna. The documents show the teenagers had previously discussed, in horrifying detail, killing up to 5 other children. This places the attack on Brianna within a broader, escalating pattern of homicidal fantasy.
And concerning that critical factor of transphobic hostility, Ratcliffe's own words provided explicit evidence for the prosecution.
That is correct. In their communication, Ratcliffe stated that he wanted to see if it will scream like a man or a girl. That one quote, seized upon by the prosecution, directly indicated hostility and contempt specifically tied to Ghey's transgender identity. While the court later determined that sadism was the primary driver for the murder, This text confirmed that Rackler's involvement was also motivated by that secondary transphobic factor.
With the plan set, the focus shifts to the final fatal sequence of events on February 11th, 2023. The key to the execution was deception. Jenkinson successfully lured Brianna to Culcheth Linear Park under the ruse that they were going to take drugs together.
The careful organization of the rendezvous speaks to the calculated nature of the plot. Jenkinson instructed Ghey to take a bus to a specific location, Culcheth Library. We've been able to reconstruct the timeline almost minute by minute through CCTV footage and mobile messages.
Let's follow that timeline precisely. It illustrates how close Brianna was to safety and how swiftly the situation deteriorated.
At 12:45 p.m., Brianna left her home, messaging her mother that she was heading out to meet Jenkinson. She walked to the nearby railway station, boarding a bus at 1:38 p.m. Just 19 minutes later, at 1:43 p.m., she met Jenkinson and Ratcliffe, whom she was meeting for the very first time at the bus stop outside the library. The sources confirm that by 2:02 p.m., the three were last seen on CCTV heading toward the park, the location where the planned attack was set to take place.
And we can see through Brianna's own texts the moment she began to realize something was wrong. It must have occurred just moments before the attack.
The messages are heartbreaking to read with hindsight. At 2:15 p.m., Brianna messaged Jenkinson, expressing her nervousness and anxiety about waiting for the drugs. She wrote, "Girl, I'ma wait where I am until we have drugs all. I'm too anxious." Jenkinson was, at the same time, meticulously running this deception campaign, exchanging messages with herself on Snapchat by posing as a fake drug dealer to keep Brianna engaged and prevent her from leaving.
But the deception failed just before 2:30 p.m.
Yes. Brianna's suspicion crystallized at 2:30 p.m. She messaged a friend, "Scarlett is so weird, girl. I think she's pretending to have a dealer."
A dealer, spelled D-E-E-L-E-R, a misspelling of dealer. She realized the drug meeting was a lie. The sources indicate that the attack began almost immediately after she sent that final message expressing her doubt.
The sources confirm she was attacked with Ratcliffe's hunting knife shortly after she voiced that suspicion, and this horrific moment was briefly partially witnessed.
A couple walking their dog in the park spotted Jenkinson and Ratcliffe from a distance in the area where the attack occurred, and critically, after the teenagers realized they had been spotted, and therefore had witnesses, they fled the scene. This detail suggests a moment of panic interrupted the intended disposal or aftermath of the crime.
The dog-walking couple then approached the area and made the discovery that led to the emergency call.
That's right. They discovered Brianna's body face down and bleeding profusely. They called the emergency services at 3:13 p.m. Tragically, despite their immediate response, Brianna Ghey was pronounced dead at the scene by paramedics at 4:02 p.m. The subsequent postmortem examination revealed the true, horrific nature of the assault, confirming the prosecution's description of it as extremely brutal and punishing.
The examination found that Brianna Ghey had been stabbed 28 times across multiple areas of her body: her head, her neck, her chest, and her back. The sheer number of wounds and their distribution directly contradicts any notion that this was a crime of momentary passion. It was a prolonged, sadistic assault, reflecting the dark fantasies that Jenkinson had spent months cultivating online.
The immediate investigation moved rapidly, leading to the arrests of two 15-year-olds the very next day. This section looks at the initial police approach, which was cautious regarding motive, and the really complex legal processes that followed.
Both Ratcliffe and Jenkinson were arrested simultaneously at their respective homes on February 12, 2023. Initially, Detective Chief Superintendent Mike Evans made a public statement that was later the subject of some controversy. He reported there was, quote, "no evidence to suggest that the circumstances surrounding Brianna's death are hate-related," though he correctly identified it as a targeted attack.
Right, and that initial caution on the hate crime motive sparked immediate concern within the LGBTQ+ community. They worried the context of Brianna's life was being overlooked.
And that concern drove a swift shift in the inquiry. Just 2 days later, by February 14th, the police publicly updated their position. They confirmed they were investigating all lines of inquiry, which formally included the possibility of a hate crime. The suspects were then charged with murder the following day, on February 15th.
The trial commenced at Manchester Crown Court on November 27, 2023. And given that the defendants were minors, strict reporting restrictions were immediately imposed, which complicated the media narrative for weeks.
Indeed. The court proceedings referred to Jenkinson as Girl X and Ratcliffe as Boy Y. These anonymity orders were maintained throughout the trial to protect the defendants' identities while they were still legally children. A key element of this trial, setting it apart from many others, was the need to navigate the severe neurodivergence and mental health issues of both accused teenagers.
What were the specific diagnoses that necessitated these legal accommodations?
The profile changed slightly over time. Jenkinson was initially found to have traits of autism and ADHD while in custody, though she was later officially diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Ratcliffe, following his arrest, was diagnosed with autism and specifically selective mutism, meaning he was functionally incapable of speaking to anyone except his mother.
That presents a monumental challenge in a courtroom setting where defendants are expected to participate and respond. How did the judge ensure the trial remained fair while accommodating Ratcliffe's inability to speak?
Well, the court made reasonable and necessary adjustments. Ratcliffe was allowed to communicate his testimony and his answers by typing them out on a computer, which was then presented to the court. Additionally, both teenagers were given the option to participate remotely via video link rather than being physically present during all of the proceedings. Furthermore, the jury was given explicit instructions from the judge that the defendants' various degrees of neurodivergence could affect how they behaved or spoke during the trial. This was to ensure the jury did not misinterpret their demeanor as evidence of guilt or a lack of remorse. It was a vital legal step to maintain impartiality.
And when the time came for the defense, we saw a brutal collapse of their alliance. Both teenagers pleaded not guilty and then proceeded to deploy highly aggressive defense strategies that entirely blamed the other for the actual killing.
This strategy of mutual blame shifting was central to the trial. Each defense team attempted to minimize their client's involvement, presenting them as an accessory or, in Jenkinson's case, a manipulated bystander.
Let's break down Ratcliffe's defense first. How did he try to distance himself from the murder itself?
Ratcliffe's defense team claimed that Jenkinson was the instigator. They argued she was the one who told him to bring the knife and that she had a plan to stab Brianna. His excuse for going along with the plan was shocking in its casualness. He claimed he didn't take her plan seriously because she was always talking about murder and nothing happens. Therefore, he argued he was merely present when Jenkinson carried out the stabbing. And crucially, his defense vehemently denied any trans animosity toward Ghey and argued that his autism made him susceptible to Jenkinson's manipulation.
Jenkinson's defense offered a similarly cynical but contradictory explanation.
Her defense conceded that she was responsible for both luring Brianna to the park and for devising the plan. But she insisted that this planning was merely a fantasy that she never intended to see through. She claimed Ratcliffe was the one who, to her shock, carried out the stabbing. And to explain her lack of intervention, she claimed she was afraid of Ratcliffe, describing him, the high-achieving student, as a sociopath.
So we have two different claims of shock, two claims of manipulation, and two claims of blame. Did the forensic evidence clearly support one of these narratives over the other?
The forensic evidence was certainly leveraged heavily by Jenkinson's defense. They pointed out that an excess amount of Ghey's blood was found on Ratcliffe's clothing. This suggested he was the one physically holding the knife during the attack. Conversely, no blood was found on Jenkinson's clothing. This detail was used to paint Jenkinson as a wide-eyed bystander.
Yet the jury ultimately rejected this attempt to absolve her. How did the prosecution successfully argue that Jenkinson was equally guilty of the fatal attack, despite the lack of blood evidence on her clothing?
The prosecution argued, and successfully, that her premeditation, her detailed plans, the luring of the victim, and her presence at the scene made her complicit as a principal player. Her own admissions, that she set up the murder and actively managed the fantasy to its final conclusion, overrode the physical evidence of who held the knife. The jury was convinced that they acted as a team, sharing the singular intention to kill Brianna Ghey. This finding of shared intent made them equally guilty of murder.
After the 3-week trial culminated in 4 hours and 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned the guilty verdict for both defendants on December 20th, 2023. This immediately moved the case into the critical phase of sentencing.
The verdict confirmed what the evidence strongly indicated, that this was a planned execution-style killing carried out by both teenagers. What followed the verdict was a crucial decision regarding public reporting.
The lifting of anonymity was a significant moment in the case, allowing the public to finally put names to the individuals known only as Girl X and Boy Y.
Judge Amanda Yip ruled on December 21, 2023, that the anonymity orders would be lifted at the sentencing hearing. This was not a casual decision. The judge stated there was a strong public interest in the full and unrestricted reporting of what is plainly an exceptional case. Given the complex legal arguments, the unique psychiatric aspects, and the profound public interest in the nature of the crime and the defendants, the judge deemed it necessary for public scrutiny. And they were named publicly as Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe.
The sentencing hearing, held on February 2nd, 2024, included powerful victim impact statements from Brianna's parents and stepfather. The legal language for the sentences given to minors is unique in the UK.
It is. Both teenagers were sentenced to be detained at His Majesty's pleasure. For our listeners who may not be familiar with UK law, this is the legal equivalent of a mandatory life sentence for those convicted of murder who were under 18 at the time of the offense. The judge then set their minimum terms. Jenkinson received a minimum term of 22 years, meaning she can apply for parole consideration in 2044. Ratcliffe received a minimum term of 20 years, making his first chance at parole in 2042.
And the judge's ruling on motive was incredibly important, as it definitively characterized the nature of the crime beyond simply murder.
Judge Yip described the murder as sadistic in nature, which accounted for the severe violence and the planning involved. And critically, concerning the role of prejudice, the judge ruled that while sadism was the overriding motive, Ratcliffe's sentence included the finding that a secondary motive was hostility towards Ghey because of her transgender identity. This formally acknowledged the prejudice evidenced in his text messages without making it the sole cause of the crime.
We also saw the final psychiatric assessments presented at sentencing, which updated the neurodivergence discussions from the trial.
Yes. Jenkinson's diagnosis was finalized as antisocial personality disorder, replacing the initial observations of autism traits. Ratcliffe's diagnosis was maintained as a mild form of autism spectrum disorder. These diagnoses were not used to excuse the crime, but rather to help understand the complex internal dynamics, particularly Jenkinson's capacity for severe premeditation and manipulation.
The police offered a reflective comment following the sentencing that tried to reconcile the complex motive finding.
Detective Mike Evans commented that although Ghey might not have been killed solely because she was transgender, her identity made her more vulnerable and accessible to the killers. He pointed to Ratcliffe's use of dehumanizing language as proof that the hostility was a contributing factor in the selection of Brianna as a target.
The severity of the minimum terms led to official scrutiny under the unduly lenient sentences scheme. Can you explain what that scheme is for our audience and what happened in this case?
The unduly lenient sentences, or ULS scheme, allows the Attorney General to review sentences handed down by a Crown Court if there is a belief that the term is so short or lenient that it represents a gross error of judgment, essentially an illegal sentence. The sentences for Jenkinson and Ratcliffe were referred for this review. However, in April 2024, the Attorney General announced that the sentences would not be reviewed, confirming that while the terms were substantial, they did not meet the very high threshold required for them to be legally deemed unduly lenient.
And Ratcliffe attempted to appeal his minimum sentence of 20 years.
He did, yes. He applied for permission to appeal in March 2024, arguing his minimum term was too harsh, given his neurodivergence and alleged manipulation by Jenkinson. However, that application for permission was refused in December 2024. The judicial system upheld the initial ruling, confirming the minimum 20-year term for his involvement in the murder.
This case moved so quickly beyond the confines of the courtroom. It sparked a powerful public reaction across the UK, intense scrutiny on media ethics, and it entered the political arena.
The grief of Brianna's family was compounded by the intense public spotlight. Brianna's mother, Esther Ghey, demonstrated remarkable strength, stating that while her daughter's death left a massive hole, she expressed profound compassion for the families of the defendants. She even noted the apparent remorselessness of the teenagers themselves during the trial.
This compassion led to an extraordinary private meeting.
Yes, in March 2024, Esther Ghey met Jenkinson's mother, publicly commending her bravery in having to navigate her own private tragedy. This gesture set an early, powerful tone for focusing on community and mental health, rather than bitterness or retribution.
And the public's financial support was instant and overwhelming.
A GoFundMe page was quickly established and raised £70,000 within 3 days, eventually surpassing £100,000. These funds were earmarked for Brianna's funeral, refurbishing her room as a tribute, and significantly for donation to a children's mental health charity, immediately shifting the focus toward prevention and support.
And the physical displays of remembrance were widespread across the UK and internationally, underlining the emotional impact of the tragedy.
Candlelight vigils were organized in dozens of cities, not just across the United Kingdom, but as far afield as Dublin, Ireland, drawing thousands of attendees. Cheshire Constabulary publicly acknowledged that Brianna's family was overwhelmed by the messages of support and solidarity pouring in. The media acknowledged this societal moment as well, with LGBTQ-themed radio stations coordinating a minute's silence on February 17th, coupled with a reflection on the discrimination faced by trans individuals.
Before we move on, it's worth noting the unfortunate incident at the crime scene itself.
Yes. Due to insensitive public behavior, a no-fly zone had to be imposed over Colchith Linear Park in the days following the murder because people were flying unauthorized drones over the area. Police had to issue a public condemnation, urging respect for the sanctity of the crime scene and the victim.
The public reaction quickly shifted to legal and symbolic matters concerning Brianna's identity. There were strong campaigns demanding posthumous gender recognition.
This is a complex area requiring careful distinction. Campaigners on Twitter and through formal petitions argued strongly that the UK government should issue a Gender Recognition Certificate, or GRC, to Brianna posthumously. They stated this was necessary to guarantee her dignity in death. The petition gathered over 13,000 signatures.
The British government ultimately rejected that petition. Why did this controversy persist if, as later reports confirmed, her death was eventually registered under her correct female gender anyway?
That is the crucial distinction between the legal fact and the political symbol. Legally, the Trans Safety Network clarified that a GRC was actually not necessary for her death to be registered under her correct female name and gender, and records confirmed this was done in the third quarter of 2023. However, for many activists, the demand for a posthumous GRC was a political and symbolic demand, an assertion that the state should acknowledge her identity without bureaucratic barriers, particularly in the face of what they saw as increasing political hostility towards trans rights in the UK. The government rejected this, stating the current policy strikes at the right balance.
The media's handling of Brianna's identity also became a massive flashpoint, with several major outlets facing severe criticism.
Initially, several major outlets, including the BBC and Sky News, were criticized for either downplaying or omitting the fact that Brianna was transgender in their early reports. But the most significant backlash was directed at The Times.
What exactly did The Times do that drew such intense criticism?
Well, The Times amended its initial story. They removed the word girl from the report and significantly included Brianna's dead name, her name assigned at birth, in the text. This action provoked outrage. Journalists, academics, and politicians condemned the move, viewing it as a deliberate act of public disrespect and dehumanization. Labour MP Charlotte Nichols explicitly accused the paper of trying to violate her dignity in death.
Did The Times acknowledge the criticism?
They did. The Times later amended the story again, removing the dead name and reinstating the word girl. But the incident, for many, underscored a broader, increasingly hostile climate toward trans people in the UK media landscape. Academics, like human rights law professor Senthoron Raj, commented that the media's approach reflected and even exacerbated anti-trans sentiment, making it harder for society to address the fundamental need for safety and respect.
And the tragic reverberations reached the highest level of UK politics, culminating in a controversial exchange during Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons.
The incident occurred on February 7, 2024. What made it so contentious was the context. Esther Ghey, Brianna's mother, was actually present in the public gallery, and she was observing a completely separate debate on mindfulness in schools, the very issue she was championing as her daughter's legacy.
And during PMQs, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak brought up trans issues.
He did. Responding to an attack from Labour leader Keir Starmer, Sunak itemized a list of policy reversals he claimed Starmer had made, and included a jibe about Starmer's alleged difficulty in defining a woman.
Starmer's reaction was immediate.
Right. Starmer instantly condemned the Prime Minister for making a political jibe about trans rights, while Brianna Ghey's mother was physically present in the chamber. It was viewed by many as profoundly insensitive, linking a political culture war point to a recent murder fueled, in part, by trans hostility.
Sunak, however, refused to apologize for the comment itself.
That's right. When Brianna's father, Peter Spooner, publicly requested an apology, Sunak refused. Instead, he shifted the blame, stating that Starmer linking his comments to the murder was the worst of politics. Esther Ghey remained focused, saying she was determined to concentrate on creating a lasting legacy for her daughter, rather than engaging in the political skirmish.
And that focus on legacy has resulted in two major campaigns that directly address the specific vulnerabilities identified in Brianna's case.
First, the Peace in Mind UK campaign. Esther Ghey launched a local campaign in Warrington to introduce mindfulness training in schools, raising £80,000 quickly. She later supported a nationwide campaign urging the government to fund these programs across all schools in England. This is a direct effort to address the mental health and anxiety issues that Brianna herself struggled with, attempting to equip young people with tools to cope with the stresses of modern life.
The second major campaign relates directly to the digital aspect of the crime and the context revealed in the inquest.
Esther Gay launched a significant campaign calling for smartphones to be banned for under 16s. She cited the clear dangers they present, particularly digital radicalization and vulnerability to predators. By February 2024, her petition supporting the ban had garnered over 90,000 signatures, indicating substantial public support for addressing the digital dangers faced by minors.
Finally, the formal inquest into Brianna's death in October 2024 provided crucial findings that reinforced the need for these legacy campaigns.
The inquest examined the circumstances of her life, paying particular attention to her mobile phone usage. Evidence showed she hid her access and activity from her mother, and that social workers often lacked the authority to remove the phone from her, highlighting the struggle parents and authorities face in monitoring digital risks.
And what did the inquest conclude regarding the school environment and the transfer of Jenkinson?
The inquest also looked into the school environment, noting that Brianna had been disciplined for phone use and dress code rules, which she had complained about as ridiculous. Importantly, after reviewing the handling of Jenkinson's transfer to Birchwood, the inquest concluded that the process had been handled appropriately by the school system and, tragically, would not have changed the outcome of the premeditated murder.
We've covered a vast range of information here, moving from the intimate details of the crime and the complex legal maneuverings to the significant political and social movements that followed.
This tragedy serves as a profound examination of the intersection of vulnerabilities and calculated hatred. Brianna Ghey, a young girl grappling with neurodivergence and seeking community, became the target of two teenagers driven by lethal fantasy and dark online influence. The judicial finding that the crime was driven by sadism, compounded by transphobic hostility, underscores the multifaceted nature of the danger she faced.
The fact that her mother, Esther Gay, has transformed her unimaginable grief into active, focused campaigns seeking mindfulness in schools and a ban on smartphones for young children provides a legacy rooted in hope and prevention. This entire sequence of events challenges us to look closely at how we protect the most vulnerable in both the physical world and the rapidly expanding digital one.
We leave you to reflect on the complexity of this tragedy, how the isolation and dark fantasy of two teenagers could coalesce into such a brutal, targeted act, and what systemic changes society must adopt, from mental health support to regulating digital access, to prevent such horrific intersections of hatred and vulnerability from ever repeating.
Thanks for listening.